Hello everyone and welcome. So, we need to talk about cavalry charges because we're all used to them from movies and stuff like that, and they always seem to be extremely efficient. Like take the Return of the King for example. Just extremely efficient. Now the question is, in reality, are those cavalry charges really that efficient? Were they really that common? And so on. Well, that's what we're going to find out in this video. So cavalry charges were relatively common all throughout history, especially in the Middle Ages, and even all the way back to antiquity. I think, if I remember correctly, the first documented cavalry charge we know of is a charge that was performed by Alexander the Great, so really far back in history. So they have existed for a long time and were used. They must have been rather efficient. And yes, they were rather efficient. Because, of course, when you are taking a whole group of cavalry and make them charge into a group of infantry, well, you have all the mass of the horse and everything just charging in. And, well, getting charged by a horse when you're on foot is not especially nice. However, they are very often extremely overrated and shown as something that you can do in any situation and it's easy to do. In reality, that's very different. There are tons of components that you need to have perfect for you to be able to even perform a charge. So first of all, you need a very specific horses to perform a charge. You cannot just grab any horse and just perform a charge with it. That doesn't work like that. You need a very specific breed of horse, and that specific breed of horse needs extremely specific training for it to even be able to perform a charge. Because horses have evolved to be really good at fleeing. That's what they're good at. And that means that the first instinct when a danger approaches is to flee. If they see a wolf, they will flee. And in the same way, if you have a whole army in front of you, well, they'll tend to flee. And therefore, you need extremely specific and hard training on a horse for it to overcome that fleeing instinct and instead do what you tell it to do, which means charging straight into a group of enemies. And that training is really expensive and can take a long time, like up to 5 years or something. And that means that most of people who had horses that were able to charge were, well, basically knights, because they were noble, they had a lot of money and could afford an expensive horse with a lot of training and could pay people to train their horses. And even if you have a very well trained horse, the rider usually needs a very strong connection and relationship with that horse for the horse to obey what the rider is telling it to do. Which means that if you have a horse that is trained to perform a charge and is capable of doing it, and you have another knight using that same horse to perform a charge, it will be way harder for him to perform a charge with that horse. It will of course be possible, at least in most cases, but it will be very hard for him to perform that charge with that horse because the horse is not used to that exact rider. And the fact that you need so specific horses to perform a charge means that you only have a small group of elite people in your army that is capable of performing a charge. So in a European medieval army, those are going to be the knights, right? You have the knights that are capable of performing a charge. Not all cavalry is going to be able to perform a charge. You have lighter cavalry, you have horse archers, for example, usually not in the European army, but if you have Mongols, well, they have horse archers. They are not going to perform a charge. They wouldn't be capable of it because their horses are simply not capable of it. So just the fact that you have cavalry doesn't necessarily mean that you can perform a charge. And even when you have well-trained horses, those horses can still perfectly well be afraid of things. For example, North Africans sometimes use camels instead of horses for their cavalry, not because camels were any better in any sort of way than horses, but because horses are naturally, for some reason, very afraid of camels, which means that if you see people performing a charge towards you, you can send your camel cavalry towards them and actually make the horses flee because they're afraid of camels. And now you have something else to add to the training. For example, getting the horse used to being around camels and thereby not being afraid of them anymore. Now, even if you have very good horses with very good riders and stuff like that, a charge is not guaranteed to succeed. And it, most of the time, needs a lot of preparation and a lot of different elements for it to actually succeed. And most of that is going to have a solid plan. Because, well, in movies and stuff, when they just charge, they just charge. They have no plan whatsoever. So you need to define an objective. Okay, you need to know what is the purpose, what are we actually trying to do. You need to have clear commands and signals. So if the commander wants to suddenly stop the charge because something goes wrong, he has clear command that he can signal to everyone else, okay, we are stopping the charge. You also need to have a withdrawal plan, because usually in movies we just see them just charge straight into a group of enemies and they just keep charging forever, basically. In reality, if you do that, well, any horse will, after some time, trip over something like a weapon or a fallen enemy or whatever. It will trip over something, and, well, if your horse falls and you are now in the middle of an enemy army, well, you're in big trouble. So you don't want that. You want to perform a charge and then actually withdraw, or perform a charge against a small group of enemy, go through that very small group of enemy, and then come back around, back to base. In reality, you would never charge straight into a massive group of enemies. You also need a lot of reconnaissance. You need to know what you are facing, how many are they, of course, but also what weapons do they have? Do they have archers? Do they have pikemen? And so on. You need to know the conditions. Is the ground completely muddy? Is the ground completely rocky? Or is it just a normal dry plain? Well, all of that really matters. If it's completely rocky, full of tons of rocks and everything, performing a charge is not possible. If the ground is very muddy, well, theoretically it's possible, but you have way higher chances of the horses, first of all, being way slower, and second, of the horse actually sliding and falling because of the mud. For example, that was what happened in Agincourt when the French knights tried to do a charge against the English. Well, the ground was completely muddy, so their charge didn't work at all because, well, the horses couldn't advance in the mud. Now, once you've scouted, well, what ground is in front of you, you can either decide to do the charge or not do it. And you can also decide a specific point on the battlefield where you are actually going to perform your charge. If the whole battlefield is muddy, well, you're not going to perform a charge. If the whole battlefield is rocky, you're not going to perform a charge. If you have a half of it that's muddy and then the other half is dry, well, you're going to perform the charge on the dry place for maximum efficiency. And now we come to the enemies you're charging at, because a charge against a disciplined infantry group that is ready to fight will basically never work, because the infantry can just keep tight formation and actually resist the charge. A charge against pikemen will almost never work because, well, they have pikes to stop the horses. A charge against a bowman will almost never work because they can shoot down your horses before you ever arrive. So you need to know that your opponents will not have pikemen, will not have archers, and will be occupied with something else and therefore not ready to fight you. So for example, if you have archers shooting at the opponent, well, they can't have pikemen because the pikemen don't have shield and will get shot by their archers. They can't have archers because, well, the archers are going to get shot by your archers, and all of the other infantry need to keep the shield up and protect themselves from the archers, and therefore cannot protect themselves from the cavalry. And that is also very important. When you are performing a charge, it is very, very rare that you're just taking all of your cavalry and only cavalry and charging in. Most of the time, you're also going to have a certain kind of support. Either you have infantry already fighting the enemy infantry and therefore stopping them from being able to reform a formation towards your cavalry. Of course, you mustn't hit your own infantry, but that's another story. Or you can have archers shooting at the enemy to, well, make them protect themselves against the archers instead of the cavalry. If you don't have that, the chances for the charge to work are very, very low. And now we also have the fact that when you see cavalry charge in movies, it's just full gallop from the start, just running straight at your enemy in a completely uncontrolled way. In reality, when you are performing a charge, the first thing you want to have is a tight formation, where every horse is like almost touching each other. Because if you don't have that, well, even if you have a trained horse, it will most probably try to not hit a person standing right in front of it. It will probably try to go a little bit to the side in order not to hit it. If you have a horse on each side of that horse, well, the horse cannot move to the side, and therefore it has to charge straight at the opponent. So you need to keep a very tight formation. That is the first thing, and of course keeping a very tight formation is very hard, especially when you're riding in full gallop. Therefore, you're going to start by walking while keeping the formation. then you're going to start trotting, still while keeping the formation. Keeping the formation is extremely important. And then only on the last maybe 100 meters or something like that, only then you'll start galloping. Because if you start galloping from the start, keeping the formation will be way, way harder. And the horses will get more tired, and therefore any kind of withdrawal will be harder because the horses are already tired, and they do get tired pretty fast because of all the armor you have on you and on the horse. So basically, when you're performing a charge, you need to have a clear objective, a clear plan. You also need to know what you are facing and the ground you will be riding on, and then you need to keep a tight formation and have a controlled approach for the charge to be successful. And when you look at movies and stuff like that, they basically have none of that. If we take the Rohan charge in The Return of the King against the orcs outside of Minas Tirith, well, they are galloping from the start. They don't know what the ground in front of them is. Well, the ground doesn't seem that bad, but they haven't checked the ground. They have no support whatsoever from archers or stuff like that. They are facing pikemen and archers, and they have basically no plan, and certainly not any withdrawal plan. So that fail is basically doomed to fail, because they are not respecting any of the rules to do a charge. So in the end, yes, cavalry charges did definitely exist. They were rather common and could be extremely efficient. But there are a lot of criteria to fulfill when you are actually performing a charge, because you are working with rather uncontrollable animals, horses, that tend to flee because that's how they have evolved. You need to know the ground conditions, you need to know what you're facing, you need to have a good plan, you need to have a withdrawal plan, you need to keep the formation, and so on. And the more of these elements that you skip, the more likely your charge is to fail. Because horses and the cavalryman are not immune, even though they're wearing heavy armor, because, well, first of all, they are riding towards the enemy, which means that all sorts of pikes or arrows and stuff incoming at them will have greater force because of the speed of the horse itself. And whatever the armor you have, you will always have gaps. Even though we're only talking about slits in the helmet to be able to see, you're always going to have gaps, and especially on the horse. For example, the legs of the horses are very, very rarely protected and are a very vulnerable point on the horse. And you also have the fact that if one horse gets killed by, let's say, an arrow, well, it will fall, and all the horses behind it will be in big trouble, because now they suddenly need to jump over that fallen horse in some kind of way, and it's not easy when they themselves are wearing armor and carrying a heavy knight and stuff like that. Not easy at all. So of course you want to keep your troops as heavily armored as possible, but they are never going to be fully protected against the enemy. And therefore you want to prevent the enemy from attacking them. And also, obviously, you want to have all of your troops ready and with functioning weapon. Thereby, you don't want to use your sword to chop at the spears of your own troops, like this guy does. Why on earth is he doing that? I don't know. Anyways, that was it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.